The drunkard's daughter was bound to the market post in disgrace, until a solitary rancher offered her bread. The shame at the market post. The morning sun had barely climbed over the ridgeline when the town of Dry Creek began to stir. Wagons rattled along the main road, vendors set out baskets of apples and fresh-cut bread, and children's laughter bounced off the dusty clapboard storefronts. It was market day, a day meant for trade, gossip, and a little cheer in the otherwise hard rhythm of frontier life. But this morning, that cheer was cut through with a ripple of unease. At the center of the square, bound with coarse rope to the market post, stood a young woman. Her hands were tied behind her back, and her head hung low, strands of dark hair falling like a curtain to shield her face from the stares of passers-by. She was slim, her dress plain and patched at the sleeves, and though she tried to shrink into herself, the weight of every eye in town pressed heavy on her shoulders. Her name was Clara Maynard, the drunkard's daughter. Her father, Jed Maynard, had stumbled into the saloon the night before and made a ruckus that left half the town furious. He owed debts, shouted curses at the mayor, and finally passed out cold on the steps of the general store. By morning, he was gone, vanished down some back alley or into the hills, but the shame he left behind clung to Clara. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't asked for this humiliation, yet the townsfolk decided someone had to bear the disgrace. And so they tied her to the post, not with cruelty exactly, but with that sharp, self-righteous sense of teaching a lesson. "It'll make her think twice about lettin' that father of hers run wild," muttered Mrs. Pettigrew, the baker's wife, as she set out her bread stand. "A girl ought to keep her kin in check." Clara heard the words, though she kept her head bowed. Shame burned hotter than the morning sun. Her father's sins were not hers, yet every glance, every whisper, every pointing finger pierced like a thorn. A group of children gathered nearby, their eyes wide. One of them, little Tommy Griggs, picked up a pebble and tossed it toward her feet. Clara flinched but didn't raise her head. Their laughter felt like salt rubbed into a wound. On the far edge of the square, leaning against the rail of his horse, stood a tall man in a weathered hat. His coat was dusty from travel, and his boots had seen more miles of hard ground than most men in town would walk in a lifetime. His name was Samuel Hart, though few spoke it often. Folks knew him simply as that rancher out on the ridge. He had lived alone on his spread for near a decade, ever since a fever had taken his wife and unborn child. He kept to himself, worked his cattle, and came into town only when necessity pushed him there. He wasn't unkind, but his silence made folks uneasy. A man with no words, no smile, no visible yearning, they called that sort of man hollow. But Samuel wasn't hollow. He was tired. And today, watching Clara bound to the post, he felt a stirring in his chest he hadn't felt in years. He saw not the drunkard's daughter, not the shame folks whispered about, but a girl trembling in the dust, punished for sins not her own. He saw hunger in the hollows of her cheeks, saw the tightness of her jaw as she tried not to weep. He remembered, for a fleeting instant, the way his wife's hands once trembled when gossip in town had turned cruel toward her family. He remembered wanting to shield her, but failing. That failure haunted him still. Now, watching Clara, Samuel felt that same ache, the ache of a man standing by while someone suffered undeserved. He stepped toward the baker's stall. Mrs. Pettigrew raised a brow at him, stiffening as though bracing against a cold wind. "Mornin', Mr. Hart," she said, her tone clipped. Samuel nodded. His voice was low, gravelly from disuse. "A loaf," he said simply, laying down 2 coins. She hesitated, then handed him the bread, warm and fragrant. He carried it in one large hand, crossing the square with slow, steady strides. The crowd's chatter faltered. All eyes turned as the solitary rancher approached the market post. Clara dared lift her gaze just slightly, peering through her tangle of hair. Samuel stopped before her. For a moment, silence weighed heavy, broken only by the restless pawing of his horse at the hitching rail. Then, without a word, he tore the loaf in half. He held out a piece to her, his weathered hand open, steady, offering. Clara blinked. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She searched his face, stern, sun-worn, unreadable, and felt a lump rise in her throat. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard. "I can't." She glanced toward the townsfolk. They'll say." "Let 'em say," Samuel interrupted, his tone even. Hunger don't care what folks say. Her stomach growled as if to betray her. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached forward, her tied hands awkward. Samuel noticed and, with quiet care, broke off a smaller piece and raised it to her lips. She hesitated only a second more before biting, the warm bread soft and filling against the sharp ache of emptiness in her belly. Tears stung her eyes. No one had shown her kindness since sunrise. Only this man, this stranger most called distant, had stepped forward. From the sidelines, whispers stirred. "What's he doin'? Feeding her, plain as day. Does he mean to shame himself too? Maybe he's soft for the girl." Samuel ignored them. He gave Clara another bite, then placed the rest of the half-loaf gently on the ground near her feet. "Eat when you can," he said quietly. Then he turned, calm as a man watering his horse, and walked back toward the edge of the square. Clara watched him go, her heart pounding. She chewed slowly, trying not to let the tears fall. She had lived with shame all her life, her father's mistakes, the town's judgment, her own silence, but never had someone met her eyes without mockery. Never had someone offered her bread, as though she mattered. The crowd thinned as noon neared. One by one, folks packed up their wares, some shaking their heads at Samuel Hart's actions, others muttering about scandal. By mid-afternoon, the sheriff came, loosening Clara's bonds. "You can go home now, girl," he said, not unkindly, but weary. "Hope this teaches you to keep that paw of yours in line." Clara didn't reply. She rubbed her wrists, sore from the rope, and clutched the half-loaf close to her chest. She walked down the dusty street, each step heavy, but in her heart a flicker of warmth burned, a flicker left by a solitary rancher's simple kindness. Far off, just before she turned the corner, she looked back. Samuel Hart was saddling his horse, preparing to ride out of town. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. He gave her the smallest nod, then swung into the saddle. For the first time in years, Clara allowed herself to hope that maybe, not all men turned away when a soul was in need. A rancher's kindness. The days after Clara's public shame were hard, but different than before. The town's whispers followed her like shadows, and yet, there was one memory that shone through them all, the rancher's quiet hand offering her bread. She carried that memory like a lantern in the dark. Her father, Jed Maynard, had not returned. Some said he was holed up in the hills with a jug. Others muttered he'd skipped town altogether. Clara knew only that her shack of a home was emptier than ever, the cupboards bare, the silence louder than the ridicule outside its walls. By the fourth evening, hunger gnawed at her. The half-loaf Samuel had given her was long gone, eaten sparingly, as if stretching it might stretch hope itself. When her knees buckled from weakness, she knew she couldn't go on this way. And so, with trembling resolve, she walked the long, dusty trail out toward the ridge where the solitary rancher lived. The ranch appeared after a mile of scrub and sagebrush, a broad spread of weather-beaten fences, cattle grazing lazily, and a cabin with smoke curling from its chimney. The sight alone felt like stepping into another world. Solid. Steady. Clara hesitated at the gate. What right had she to stand here? A girl with her name tied to shame? But her feet carried her forward anyway. Samuel Hart was in the yard, splitting wood with steady, practiced swings of the axe. He looked up when he heard her approach. His expression didn't change much, but his eyes softened just slightly. "You walked far," he said, voice low. Clara clasped her hands together, her courage shaking. Mr. Hart, I came to thank you. For the bread. It meant more than you know." Samuel leaned on the axe handle, studying her. "You look hungry still." Her cheeks flushed. She hated how easy it was for him to see through her. "I don't mean to trouble you," she whispered. I've nowhere else to turn." Silence stretched. The wind tugged at her dress, carrying the scent of cattle and pine. Finally, Samuel nodded toward the cabin. "Come inside. Supper's on." The warmth of the cabin enveloped her. It was plain but tidy, the fire crackling in the hearth, a table set with 2 plates though only one had ever been needed. Samuel ladled stew into bowls, setting one before her. The rich aroma made her eyes sting with gratitude. Clara ate slowly at first, then hungrily when she saw Samuel wasn't judging. He watched her with the patience of a man who understood what it was to starve, though his hunger had been of the heart, not the body. When her bowl was empty, she whispered, "I can work. I can sew, mend, cook. If you'll let me stay, I'll earn it." Samuel sat back, his gaze steady. "Work's plenty here. Fence needs fixing, cattle need tending. But it ain't charity you'll find here. If you stay with dignity. Understand?" She nodded fiercely, relief flooding her. For the first time in years, she felt she wasn't a burden, she was needed. The days that followed wove slowly into something new. Clara rose early, helped with cooking, learned to ride out with Samuel to check the herd. At first, her hands blistered and her back ached, but he never scolded, only showed her, step by step, how to manage the work. In the evenings, they ate together by the fire. Samuel spoke little, but when he did, his words carried weight. Clara learned that his wife had died long ago, that silence had been his only companion since. He learned that Clara loved music but had never owned an instrument, that she dreamed of reading books though her father never allowed her schooling. Something unspoken grew between them, not fiery passion, but steady warmth, like coals glowing after a long night. But peace never lasts long in Dry Creek. One gray morning, as Clara fetched water from the well, a shadow lurched through the gate. Jed Maynard, her father, staggered in, eyes bloodshot, jaw bristled with days of neglect. "Clara," he slurred, pointing an accusing finger. "Thought you'd run off from your ol' man? Hidin' with this rancher, are ya? What'll folks say?" Clara froze, her bucket trembling in her grasp. Fear coiled in her chest, the old terror of his temper rising again. Samuel stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His presence was calm but unyielding. "She's not hidin'. She's workin'. And she's safe here." Jed spat in the dirt. "Safe? With the likes of you? She's mine, my blood, my kin. She don't get to run off." Samuel's eyes narrowed. A father who sells his daughter's dignity to save his pride forfeits the right to claim her. His voice was like iron striking stone. Jed lunged forward, but Samuel moved quicker. In one smooth motion, he stepped between Clara and her father, a solid wall she had never known before. His stare bore into Jed's, steady as a mountain. "Leave," Samuel said simply. For a long, tense moment, Jed swayed, fists clenched. But Samuel's calm strength was a force he couldn't topple. With a final curse, Jed stumbled back, staggering out the gate and down the road. Clara collapsed to her knees, tears spilling freely now, not just from fear, but from the overwhelming relief of protection she had never once felt in her life. Samuel knelt beside her, laying one steady hand on her shoulder. "You're not his shame anymore," he said quietly. "Not while you're here." From that day, Clara's heart belonged not to fear, but to hope. The town gossiped, of course. Some sneered that the drunkard's daughter had snared the lonely rancher. Others whispered that perhaps kindness had taken root where none expected it. But Clara and Samuel paid them no mind. Together, they worked the land. Together, they shared laughter, quiet at first, then freer as the months stretched. In the silence of the ranch, they found companionship. In the firelight, they found something deeper. One evening, as spring painted the hills green, Clara stood on the porch watching the sunset. Samuel came beside her, his hat in his hands. "You've changed this place," he said softly. "Changed me." She turned to him, her heart pounding, searching his weathered face. "You gave me dignity when no one else would. You gave me bread when I had nothing. How could I not love you for that?" His eyes, usually so guarded, shone with something unspoken. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, and for the first time in years, Samuel Hart smiled. Beneath the fading light, they stood together, two souls once bound by loneliness and shame, now unshackled by love. Epilogue. The town of Dry Creek never forgot the day the drunkard's daughter was tied to the market post. But in time, they spoke less of the shame and more of what came after, how she found a home, a purpose, and a man whose silence held more devotion than 100 words. And though life on the ranch remained hard, Clara carried with her always the memory of that first kindness, a solitary rancher breaking bread, and a lonely girl learning she was worth saving.